Hello and welcome to Ideas Having Sex with Chris Kaufman. I'm Chris Kaufman, and each show I bring to you an interesting and provocative scholar to discuss topics in social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you enjoy what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. Hey everybody, and welcome to Ideas Having Sex. I'm Chris Kaufman, and today I'm joined by my returning guest, economist David Friedman. David is the author of The Machinery of Freedom, Guide to a Radical Capitalism, which is one of the founding texts of modern anarcho-capitalism. David, thank you for joining me.
I'm glad to be here. Actually, you're joining me since this is happening in my living room.
Thank you for letting me join you.
My dining room, sorry.
My first in-person interview of the show, so hopefully there's no horrific technical glitches. Unusually for this, I'm not having this episode center completely around a book, but if it is centering around a book, I wanted to talk to you about anarchism and anarcho-capitalism. So Machinery of Freedom, which you wrote in 1973.
I think I wrote it in 1971, and I think it was published in 1972, but I won't swear to that.
Okay, well.
Anyway, about 50 years ago.
Somewhere there. So if we are talking about a book, it's that one, but we don't have to be bound by that at all. So first of all, what exactly, without defending it or getting too deep into a description, what exactly is anarcho-capitalism?
It's support for a system in which there is no government and the useful functions of government are provided privately in a general private property and trade kind of framework. That is, that the problem that all societies face is the coordination problem. How, given that we have very interdependent societies, do you make sure that there's enough coal mined to make the amount of steel that's needed to make the cars that people want to buy, and multiply that a millionfold through the whole system? And the only way that seems to work very well on a large scale for solving that problem is a market, a system of private property and trade. A lot of people who consider themselves anarchists don't believe in the market, but as far as I can tell, they don't have a good alternative. So the anarcho-capitalist view is that you have something like our present economic structure, in the sense of a world where people own stuff and own themselves, and if you want somebody to work for you, you have to make a deal with him he's willing to accept, and all the rest of that stuff, but that is expanded to include the things that are now done by government.
And how did you come to be an anarchist personally?
That's interesting. I think my position initially, which means at about age 15 or so, 14, 15, something like that.
Is when you first started thinking about these kinds of things?
I probably started thinking about it earlier, but by the time I had things reasonably well worked out, was pretty much a classical liberal position, that I thought that the market was the right way to do almost everything, but that in order to do it, you needed a framework of law and law enforcement that had to be produced outside of the market. And I felt as though I could sort of prove that as a theorem, even though I hadn't really done so. It seemed sort of obvious. And I then read a science fiction novel, which did to me a persuasive job of portraying a society in which the legal system was endogenous, in which the framework of law and law enforcement was coming out of the society itself rather than by a government. It was a fictional world. It was the moon is a harsh mistress. It was basically a society existing on the moon at a point when the moon was a prison colony, but there were a bunch of people who were no longer prisoners, and there was no authority enforcing rules on them. As far as I could tell, it was a consistent story. It seemed to me he had described a system that would work, could plausibly work, and a theorem is destroyed by a single counterexample. So if it was true that one could have a believable system of that sort, then it couldn't be true that the framework always had to be produced from the outside, and that started me thinking about, in something more like the world I lived in, what such a framework would look. Now, you've mentioned my first book, but it's also relevant, my most recent book, which was a few years back, which is called Legal Systems Very Different from Ours. because one of my conclusions from the work that went into that book was that in writing my first book, I had been reinventing the wheel. That is to say, that there had in fact been real world societies, not on the moon, in which the legal structure was being produced endogenously from the interaction of the people without any government. They were in much simpler societies than ours. Uh, at least one of them actually looks a little bit like what I invented, namely the traditional Somali system, others less so. I don't know whether Heinlein, who wrote the novel, was aware of those or not. He may have been. He may have been modeling on some of that. But in any case, I thought that was very interesting. So I tried to work out how you could imagine such a system working in our society, and I came up with what I still think is a plausible structure in which you have a society where there are private firms that sell the service of protecting your rights and settling your disputes. There will obviously be the potential for conflict between people who are customers of different firms, but it's in the interest of the private firms to have arrangements to settle those conflicts peacefully in a way that's generally satisfactory to their customers. So each pair of firms that might have customers interact agree in advance on a private court that they will abide by. That agreement is enforced by the fact that they're repeat players, and each firm knows that if it reneges on the agreement, when its side loses, then the other one won't accept it when its side loses, and then they don't have a way of providing a peaceful settlement for their customers. So that was the basic framework. It seemed to me plausible, and I got interested in it, and I sketched out some of the economics of that system and more later, and concluded that not only would it be a system without a government, it would be a system more likely to produce libertarian law than a political system was, because like other market systems, it would tend to produce economically efficient results, to results that, loosely speaking, maximize the summed benefit to the people involved. And since I, like most libertarians, believe that liberty is generally economically efficient, that it is rarely the case that you gain more by violating my rights than I lose. Consequently, a legal system that protects individual rights will tend to, roughly speaking, maximize the welfare of the people under it. Therefore, the market for law in the system that I had described ought to generate reasonably efficient law, and therefore reasonably libertarian law. And I think, in a sense, that's what I think of in a way as my main contribution to the anarcho-capitalist literature, as it were, because as far as I can tell, other people in that tradition more or less assumed that philosophers would figure out what was right and then all the judges would enforce it. And that does not strike me as a very plausible way of running a society. I observe that even among libertarians, there's actually quite a lot of disagreement about what rights people have. Intellectual property would be an obvious example, where some libertarians think it's the most fundamental source of property, and others think it's obviously a violation of rights. So I don't think the idea that we will have a society where all of the courts agree on libertarian law because libertarian law is right is very plausible. And what I had set up was a society where it would be in the rational self-interest of judges to make essentially libertarian law, because that would be what their customers wanted to buy, and their customers wanted to buy it because that was what their customers were selling to their customers, namely the individuals who paid for having their rights protected. So as I say, I think that's probably the point where I don't know of anyone else in that tradition who made that line of argument, and I think it's an important one. I've got a series of blog posts that I'll probably be putting out at some point in the next month, which touch on that question.
Well, are you selling yourself short a little bit? I mean, in addition to that contribution, you're not the first person to have proposed the idea of something like market anarchism, but you're definitely in the founding wave of the modern American tradition. I mean, is there,
Yes.
prior to yourself and Rothbard and the Tannehills, is there anyone else, someone who was alive at the time, who was writing about this?
I don't think so. I don't know enough about the late 19th, early 20th century individualist anarchists. My impression is that you don't get a sort of serious economic analysis of it, or at least if you get it, it's wrong, because a bunch of those people had somewhat bizarre economic ideas that you have the idea that if you had a competitive banking system, interest rates would be zero or close to zero, which seems to have been shared by a number of the sort of Warren Tucker group of people.
I think that was less true of the British kind of anarchists, like people like Auberon Herbert. And
I don't know enough about them.
There's apparently a ton of journals of quasi, they didn't call themselves anarchists, or they vehemently denied that they were anarchists. Like Ayn Rand vehemently denied that she was a libertarian, but they were writing more in that vein and less in the vein of those kinds of economic beliefs.
Yeah, I just don't know those people. There's as you probably know, a French writer earlier than that,
Molinari.
Yeah, who some people think is sort of the earliest anarcho-capitalist, but he doesn't seem to have a very sophisticated analysis either. But no, I mean, I think I made lots of useful arguments. But if I ask where is there an idea that you don't find in the other people who were writing at the time, I think that's the important one. And I think that, I mean, I have lots of disagreements with Murray Rothbard on lots of things, but I think the only important one is that I believe he imagined that the legal code would be basically being produced by libertarian philosophers, whereas I see it coming out of a market.
Do you think that the tendency of common law is to produce more libertarian law when it's not responding to legislation?
Well, that would be an implication of Posner's thesis. Posner claims that the common law tends to be economically efficient, and I don't think he's produced a good argument for why you would expect it to be, and the empirical argument is dubious. I spend, one of the things I do in my book, Law's Order, is to look at cases where common law is economically efficient and where it isn't economically efficient, and to argue that there are quite a lot of cases where once you know where the law is, you can always figure out an argument to show it's efficient. There's one case where you have two parts of the law where the economic issue is the same in both of them. They have the opposite rule, and Posner separately claims both of them to be economically efficient. I don't think it occurred to him that they were really the same problem. I discussed that in Law's Order. So I'm not at all sure that the common law is economically or liberal. I mean, I suppose common law tends to be pretty close to libertarian intuitions, but I wouldn't say that there's a reason why it has to be, as it were.
I wouldn't think so either. Just like you acknowledge that in some circumstances, anarcho-capitalist legal code might not be libertarian, but it would probably tend to be more libertarian.
Yeah. I guess maybe the clearest case where common law is at least inconsistent with my moral intuitions is that if I tortiously kill you, I owe no damages because your claim dies with you. If I tortiously injure you, I owe damages to you. And under statutory changes in the U.S. context, I might owe damages for killing you to other people who are worse off by your death. You say to your wife or to your employer, maybe. But I don't owe any damages under U.S. law for the loss of the value of your life to you.
Do you know the origin of that common law rule?
No, but I think I think what it's coming from is the idea that you have to have a claimant,
sure,
and the only claimant isn't around anymore. Anyway, so that would be one example, but I think there are probably other examples. I mean, common law is pretty good, but one of the points that I try to make in explaining why I find what I see, at least as Rothbard's view, unconvincing is that designing a legal code is a much more complicated problem than non-lawyers think it is. I think any intelligent person who has gone through law school, say, should realize that in deciding what the law is, there aren't simple arguments which give you clear answers to all of the questions, that there are a whole lot of cases where it's, well, this reason for that and that reason for that and so forth. And therefore, I'd much rather have that kind of problem solved by a market than by a philosopher.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, I think especially when you're talking about conflicts that are not clean, when you're not designing the conflict in an armchair and you're in the real world, and a lot of times, some of the conflicts might be over who actually is the rightful claimant of something because you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of libertarianism, how do you think your views have changed most since you wrote Machinery?
The clearest thing that where my view has changed, but it's not really an important thing, is that I think is economics. And that is, I think I was more sympathetic to the idea of an agoric economy then than I am now. The idea of an economy where you have no employees, where everybody in effect is a subcontractor, feels right from a sort of libertarian intuition kind of view. And I sort of like interacting in that context. When I self-publish my books, for example, Amazon is not an employee of me, I'm not an employee of theirs, and so forth. On the other hand, there's a literature which ultimately goes back to Coase's classic article on the theory of the firm, which I think convincingly shows that there are good reasons why firms exist. That if you think of it sort of as a libertarian, I assume you're familiar with the calculation controversy, the argument.
I couldn't explain it in good detail, but yes, I am. But you can.
It's basically an argument between people like Mises and socialist economists such as Abba Lerner on whether you could have a socialist economy that worked. And if you think about it, if you really accept the Mises, etc., view, you not only shouldn't be able to have a socialist economy that worked, you shouldn't be able to have a firm that works. Because the argument is that you can't figure out top down how to do an allocation problem. You need to do it in the decentralized market form. And that's clearly too strong.
Isn't the view that you couldn't have a centrally planned economy or even a firm without any external market from which to judge the inputs?
But if you think about the argument, even with an external market within the firm, you've got a bunch of things that the time of one of your employees, it's not like he's working, 14 hours for you and 12 hours for somebody else. And you can say, what's the marginal cost of diverting an hour from the one job to the other? That within the firm, after all, in that sense, the socialist system has maybe not exactly prices, but they can say, do we win a war? The socialist system can trade with other countries, so there are prices in that sense. But nonetheless, both the firm and the socialist system have to do a sort of top-down centralized planning thing. And the point Coase made is that it's not impossible, it's just costly. It just doesn't work very well. But there are costs to dealing with things on the market as well. That if I rely for a critical input in what I'm producing on you or producing that, and you decide to go on vacation, I'm not controlling you. Turns out that nobody else is producing that particular input at the moment, so I got to shut down for 2 weeks. And there's an interesting article by somebody else, but coming ultimately from Coase's ideas about the inside contracting system in the U.S. in the 19th century, where you did have things where what's now done by one firm was being done by multiple firms, and what the reasons are that it eventually more or less died out. So anyways, it's not really political philosophy, it's just economics, but it seems to me that while I may find the vision of agoric economy a pretty vision, there are good reasons why you actually have a mix. I think the way I put it at some point in one of my books was that the market economy is a market beach made up of socialist grains of sand.
Yes, that sounds right.
Anyway, but the more important thing, I think, is that I've become less convinced of the power of moral arguments over time, in the sense that there are problems with the libertarian moral argument. The obvious big one is ownership of unproduced resources such as land, but you can think of others. And it seems to me that the consequentialist argument is a stronger argument. That is to say that most people disagree in detail on their values, but most people think it's a good thing for people to be happy. It's a bad thing for people to starve to death and stuff like that. And I think most of the political disagreement ultimately comes down not to differing values, but to differing beliefs about the consequences of doing various things. That I think there's almost nobody who is in favor of raising the minimum wage who also believes that the result of raising the minimum wage is that many unskilled workers will be unemployed.
I asked Brian Kaplan about this, that there are economists who favor minimum wage laws, and surely they understand. And I asked him, behind closed doors, why do you think economists who favor these kinds of things do, despite understanding the arguments? And I don't know. The answer he gave was the support is relatively lukewarm. It's mostly about symbolism. They probably wouldn't support if the wage were too high.
But there are two complications to that. The first is that there are circumstances in which a minimum wage law would have good effects. That just aren't the circumstances that apply to our economy.
Sure.
And that's an argument which I only first came across in the famous pro-minimum wage piece that was controversial a while ago, but it turns out that Stigler had made it much earlier. That if you have an economy which is where the employers are monopsonists, where you have an employer who is the only employer for that set of workers, then the employer will pay below the marginal value product for the same reason that a monopolist sells at above marginal cost. And in that context, the minimum wage can actually do good. Now, it's not
it'll raise the wages without putting people out of work because it's still in the benefit of the
putting more people into work, because the employer in that case is deliberately holding down employment in order to hold down wages, just like a monopolist holds down output in order to hold up prices.
Yes.
And so it's a neat technical point, and I only wish that Jim Buchanan were around so that I could point it out to him, because he was the one who said that the proposition that all economists agree that increasing the minimum wage will create unemployment, and that is not an empirical statement. That's a definition of economist. And I still remember his saying that when we were colleagues. And I think he's in a sense wrong, in that a good economist could say, well, if you're observing this kind of an economy, and it won't be true. But the more serious reason is that one might believe that the unemployment effect is small. That's an empirical question. Certainly, I'm not competent to have an opinion on it. So you might therefore believe that a minimum wage law will make the society a little bit poorer, but make low-paid workers noticeably better off, and that you might consider that a desirable outcome. So
that probably depends on like the specific utility effects of having a slightly higher job versus being unemployed. That seems wildly implausible to me. That the being unemployed seems like a pretty discontinuous jump down in utility.
But if what's happening is that 100 people get unemployed and 10,000 people get a much higher wage, then
sure.
Anyway,
point is it's possible. You don't.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So, but I don't know. I'm not sure I know any economists who are in favor of a higher minimum wage, and in particular, Krugman, I think, is holding that position for purely political reasons, since he's on record from back when he was actually an economist rather than a professional public intellectual, as taking the same position on minimum wages as the rest of us do. But there might be somebody who did. It's not impossible.
Hey everyone, this is Chris Kaufman, and I just wanted to take a break to thank you all from the bottom of my heart for listening to these episodes and giving me the opportunity to speak with people I admire and read amazing books every week, every other week, whatever. If you are interested in helping this little engine that could of a show grow, please just recommend it to a friend. Recommend it to a friend. Maybe give it a 5-star rating on one of those places you listen to it at. But really, if you just recommend it to someone, that goes a long way for a small show like this. So thank you again. Thank you for listening. Keep listening. And back to the show. As far as you becoming less confident in the power of moral arguments, what do you think about the contrast that, say in a previous generation of libertarian scholars, maybe the two most influential are your father and Ayn Rand, and are famous for making exactly these different kinds of arguments, moralizing, strident arguments for Ayn Rand and more consequentialist arguments for your father, and Milton Friedman, for those who don't know. And both of them are famous for being quite influential. I mean, does this show that there's just different market niches for which strategies are going to be effective?
Yeah, but I'm opposed to bad arguments.
Okay.
And as far
so
as
it's not about it being effective. It's you think it's effective for the wrong reasons.
In the case of Rand, she was brilliant, courageous, arrogant, but in my view, at least, she was wrong. That is to say, not necessarily wrong about her conclusions, but She claimed that she could, in effect, prove what the right moral views were. And I spend a chapter in the 3rd edition of Machinery of Freedom trying to debunk her purported.
And years arguing online, doing the same.
Yes, correct. Back in the old Usenet days, long ago, I spent a good deal of time on humanities philosophy objectivism, arguing with people. And the best of the people I was arguing with was Jimbo Wales, who went on to start Wikipedia, who was an interesting guy.
I don't know if he still talks about being an objectivist or if he still considers himself one.
Nor do I. I don't know that either. But he was the only person I can remember arguing with who was making a serious attempt to understand my position and to find problems with it. And he didn't get it quite right, but he was pretty close in terms of problems. So I appreciated that. But anyway, that was a lot of fun.
I think we talked about that last time you were on the show, because I spent a lot of time reading those arguments, and I'll probably bug you every time we talk to dig them up at some point and include them in some kind of compilation work.
Yeah, I don't know. In principle, Usenet is still there, and
it's subsumed under Google Groups or something, or it was at one point. I don't even know if that's a thing anymore.
And it might be worth. I have a feeling that at some point I did find a link for my arguments about Rothbard's history of economics stuff, which was a different long thread that I had.
Is this where you're arguing that he's made dishonest arguments about Adam Smith's position on wool tariffs or something?
On a bunch of things,
yeah.
But that's what's really striking is the contrast between his treatment of Smith and his, I'm trying to remember the name, but there's one of the French...
Cantillon? Or
not Cantillon.
Turgot.
Turgot. That he accuses Smith of not being a libertarian because Rothbard doesn't get it right, but in fact, Smith felt that some government subsidy to schooling might be desirable, might not be desirable. Turgot writes a letter to the King of France when Turgot was a French minister, proposing the nationalization of the educational system. Rothbard regards Turgot as the good libertarian and Smith as the not one, and of course never mentions Turgot's support for having the government not only take over the whole educational system but write the textbooks as well.
Did you find evidence that he was aware of that letter, or is he just studiously ignoring it when it was pointed out?
It is in a book that Rothbard wrote the introduction to.
Well, there you go. I heard Brian Kaplan say that he was a brilliant guy, but when he got the answer he wanted, he was fanatical about keeping it regardless of counter arguments.
Yeah, that's a fair statement. But anyway, but my point really is just that there are a couple of interesting threads on Usenet from those days, and it would be sort of neat if somebody could set up a set of links that would let one easily browse those threads. So if you have nothing else to do with your plenty of spare time. Part of what I did when I set up my Substack was to mine both my blog. Well, it's more complicated than that. Some years ago, I decided that I didn't have any new ideas that were worth writing a book about, but I had a whole lot of old ideas. So I went through all of my blog posts sorting them into groups of posts on the same subject, which could be turned into chapters. And I then put up on my web page a whole bunch of chapter drafts with the idea that at some point I would get organized enough to assemble them into a book or two. And I then mined those, which were really largely my blog post ideas at secondhand rewritten into things, for the early parts of my Substack, which was how I was able to run a Substack post every day for a while at the beginning of it, which is obviously impossible. and I'm still mining them some. That is, one of the nice things about the Substack is that I haven't only done that I've ended up writing a fair number of things that were new.
Yeah. Are you still planning on doing the book, the collection?
Probably at some point, though in that case I may take the next generation, that is, take the rewritten versions of Substack posts as the basis for the chapters. Yeah, no, it would presumably, one sizable chunk of it would be on climate issues, because that's one thing I've posted about quite a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And another chunk would probably be on libertarianism, and it may end up more than one book, but I've got categories at the moment. And the categories that I mostly finished turning blog posts into chapters on are libertarianism, economics, climate, and a couple of smaller ones. There's one on sort of marriage and related things. There's one on religion, which is fairly short, but I thought I had some interesting things to say there. So I've just been taking apart, reassembling a group of the chapters for stuff having to do with libertarianism, and that's what I'll probably be doing putting them out in the next month or so. When I finish, basically, I want to put up the one that I'm working on for today, which is on my argument that there is no right of national self-determination, that there's no moral argument for it, and a very dubious consequentialist argument for it.
The dubious consequentialist argument is, would that be something like people who are like you and close to you are more likely to rule you justly and fairly than distant people?
Might be true. I don't know if that's true or not, but my point is, if you actually look at the evidence,
exactly, yeah, that sounds plausible at first blush, but it's not obvious that
it doesn't look very good.
Yeah.
Now, it's hard to be sure, because it may well be that there are other reasons why some very bloody civil wars happened.
Sure.
After independence. But anyway, I would like to be able to do one on the implication of my views for the present Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that's going to be a much harder problem. I don't know if I can actually do a satisfactory version of that or not. That, in a sense, the simple libertarian answer is the Israelis should compensate those Palestinians whose land was seized in 1948, and everybody should be free to migrate to Israel if they want, including Palestinians. And the problem with that, of course, is that some noticeable fraction of the Palestinians want to kill all of the Jews and are therefore very dangerous neighbors. And then the interesting part there is that if you accept that argument, which I'm inclined to say that if the odds that somebody, if you let him into close to your land, will kill you are high enough, you're then entitled to keep him away. But then that argument also implies that in principle, the Palestinians in the 1920s were entitled to keep the Zionists away.
Sure.
Because after all, some of the Zionists. Now, I think it probably, as far as I can tell from reading stuff on that, probably most of the immigrants until fairly late were not actually planning to set up a Jewish state which would have only Jews in it.
I think that's right.
I think there were some of the extreme Zionists who did have that view. And if all they wanted to do was to have a bunch of immigrants, and maybe when they got them, my guess is that many of them were thinking in the context of the British Protectorate anyway, and we're just saying what we want to do is to have a bunch of Jews in British Palestine and have it a place where Jews can go to and where they have their own community and so forth. And I don't think that the Palestinians had any legitimate right to object to that. But insofar as they imagined what actually ended up happening, if they had sort of perfect prophecy, then they would have an argument for keeping the people from immigrating, just as the Israelis today have. So maybe that may be where I'll end up if I try to write that Substack. But
Does that counterfactual though? I mean, how much does it depend on having perfect prophecy abilities? Because you could,
but it's more than that, because you could argue on the other side that if the Palestinians hadn't engaged in violence against the Jews, this never would have happened. That
are you talking about the current controversy, or
no? You have Palestinian violence against the Jews in the 1920s. There's a riot in 1929 where several hundred people are killed. And the question is whether in an alternate history in which the Palestinians behaved morally, as it were, whether you would have ever gotten, I mean, after all, Israel at present has Arab inhabitants, quite a lot of them.
Sure.
The ones who didn't leave. And the thing is, I don't really believe that anybody has a right to vote, because I don't believe in governments. So in that sense, the idea of they wanted to have a majority in order to set up their government to make rules we don't like, well, that's equally true if you had a government that made rules other people didn't like. That's anyway, I have to think it through more carefully.
It'll make an interesting post, though.
Yeah.
I think, Israel and Palestine presents an example that begs to be used for libertarians who are not absolutists but favor things like open borders. Most of them do. Some libertarians curiously, somehow circuitously argue that open borders is not the libertarian position, but it's possible that there are, even Brian Kaplan, who is famous for his open borders position, I think has given examples. Yeah, and the example he usually gives is if there's a reasonable chance that like open borders might lead to a civil war, it's probably a good reason to be a little bit careful about it.
Yes. Anyway, it is a very unpleasant situation at the moment, and one of the points that I make in the one that I'm probably going to put up today is that if you take seriously the attitude which implies a right of self-determination, namely that groups have rights, that groups are people, as it were, which is really the underlying, I think, mistaken intuition in that, then one of the implications is that groups can also be guilty. And at that point, you get the, I think, mistaken moral intuition, which is driving both the Hamas raiders, that their view was, yes, these particular Jews we're killing didn't do anything to us, but they are part of a group that drove us out of our country, of our land, essentially. And the intuition of lots of people as a result of the raid, which is that
Palestinians are,
the Gazans are murderers.
Yes.
And therefore deserve to have bad things happen to them. And that's very different from the position I would hold, which is particular Gazans are murderers. And it's true that killing those people may kill some innocents in the process because, you've got the human shield problem. But it isn't that the Gazans who are not part of Hamas and did not engage in this or in planning for this themselves deserve to die. It's only that they might unfortunately get killed in the process of going after people who do deserve to die. And those are very different attitudes and have different implications.
Are you familiar with, and if so, what do you think of Brian Kaplan's Simple Case for Pacifism?
I don't think I've read it.
It's a short blog post, and it's not like Lefebvrean, Tolstoyan absolute pacifism. It's more pacifism as a very strong principled objection to war in pretty much every case. And he starts with the forced organ donation hypothetical. Is it right to, if you can, you're familiar with it, but for the audience who's not, if you're a doctor and you have 5 people who each need a different organ, and one person who's got 5 healthy organs, might it be moral to kill that one person, distribute his 5 organs, and save 5 people? Most people say no, it's not a knockdown argument, but that seems intuitively implausible that would be a moral thing to do to most people. So he takes that as a jumping off point that killing one person is not justified even if you're saving 5 people, and that future events are very hard to determine. Experts notoriously have very bad predictive judgment about how wars and political events are going to turn out, and wars always involve the deliberate or reckless endangerment of innocent lives. So if you can't guarantee, or more or less guarantee, at least a 5-to-1 ratio of innocents saved to killed, war is not justified, and modern wars essentially never meet that threshold.
And therefore, if another country invades you, you should surrender.
I don't know if that's exactly the conclusion, but that is one problem. But if it's not, if you are going to kill an innocent person, you still are left with the question, what's the justification for recklessly endangering or killing an innocent person? Or if someone was invading your house right now and the only thing you could do to stop them was to fire a bomb that would kill some of your neighbors, are you justified in doing that? It's not that it's a easy.
So my solution to this problem is that my weapon for home defense is a sword, not a firebomb.
Well, and
sitting up on top of that.
Part of the solution might be that modern state methods of war are morally indefensible because they typically involve.
Therefore, but the problem always arises if a country that does not hold these views invades a country whose inhabitants hold these views. Do they surrender?
Possibly. And it's possible that it might be better off. I mean,
they might be, but then the obvious next step of the argument is that the widespread acceptance of this principle will make invasion very profitable because you won't have to worry about anybody shooting back. At which point, the states that support this kind of position will get eliminated by states that don't.
Isn't that only true if war is more profitable than trade or other things?
No, because it isn't going to be war. Conquest of pacifists is cheap.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real problem. But does it answer the moral question of, are you morally justified?
I should argue this with Brian.
You should.
More fun because I haven't even read his essay.
I think
there are prudential arguments for a non-interventionist foreign policy.
Sure,
but it becomes harder to make the argument if it includes the idea that if anybody invades you, you have to surrender.
We'll leave it there, but I definitely believe it's a tricky problem, but I'm largely convinced by his argument. I got a list of common libertarian controversies that have different views on different libertarian sides. I was wondering if you could briefly maybe say something about what you think the controversy is and what your position is and why. So libertarians have widely different views on abortion, immigration, war, moral foundations, strategy, and what cultural and social attitudes are warranted or supportive of libertarianism. So I just listed a few. We don't have to talk about all of them. Do any of those jump out at you as something you want to respond to?
Well, I mean, in general, I'm in favor of free immigration for obvious reasons, and with the usual qualification that if you have free immigration to a welfare state, you've got to have restrictions on the degree to which the immigrants get welfare. And that probably also means restrictions on how easily they get to vote, because otherwise they'll vote to give themselves welfare if there are enough of them. Let's see, other than that, abortion, I think that is a hard problem. What the problem is ultimately coming from is that we are using binary moral categories for continuous situations.
Person and non-person.
That it seems to me pretty clearly that somebody who wants to murder his 3-year-old should be prevented from doing so. It seems to me quite implausible that somebody who wants to use a form of contraception that prevents the fertilized ovum from implanting should be free to do so. In between those, you have what's really a continuous, not a discrete change, and yet your moral intuitions are that there's got to be a rule one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a problem which I don't see how you're going to, unless somebody comes up with a much clearer moral view than I've seen, I don't see how you're going to get an answer. And sort of my own view is that probably abortion is not something you ought to make illegal, but is something one should have serious reservations about doing. But I can certainly understand somebody on either side of that position.
You've pointed out before that even if it does seem like an open and shut case to you, normally it's someone who is in favor of legal abortion arguing against someone who's not in favor of it. But another interesting question is someone who is in favor of abortion arguing with someone who's also in favor of infanticide being legal.
I think that's useful as a way of getting the people who are in favor of abortion to realize that it's a harder problem than they want to believe.
Sure.
Because there is not a fundamental moral difference between a baby half an hour before it's born and half an hour afterwards.
Sure. And historically, infanticide has been common for a lot of the same reasons that abortion has been common.
Yes. I think in a situation in the U.S. with regard to abortion, if I understand it, was that early term abortion in the 19th century wasn't thought of as abortion. that it was preventing quickening, and that the sort of serious opposition to abortion is, I think, fairly late, maybe in early 20th century development. On the other hand, one of the things that a lot of American supporters of abortion don't realize is that most of Europe, the rules are more restrictive than the rules in the US, not less. That is, that in most of Europe, late term abortions are illegal, except under special circumstances. Early term abortions are legal. I think that's a correct statement.
Yeah, I looked into that at one point, and it seemed like the US as a country has, well, especially now, 50 states and 50 different ways of legislating abortion, and they span being simultaneously much stricter and much more lenient than almost any European countries.
Yep. But anyway, so let's see. Abortion and immigration.
Moral foundations.
Yeah, I think they're very weak.
How does your moral foundation of libertarianism, which you don't stress too much, but do talk about sometimes, how do you think it differs from Michael Huemer's vision, which are both
our
similar?
position is very, I think the only different disagreement I know that I have with Huemer is that he is more confident that our position is right than that I am. That is to say, we're both intuitionists. In my view, the serious challenge to our position is one which holds that all moral beliefs are an illusion, that is something we've been tricked into by our genes or our culture or whatever. And that, it seems to me, is consistent with the available evidence, that one can explain what Mike and I want to take as evidence of moral reality can be explained as the product of a common cause along those lines. And I reject that basically because I cannot in fact believe it, but I don't think that I've got an adequate argument to show that it's false. And Mike thinks he does. And we've discussed that a little bit. And you probably haven't read enough of his stuff to have spotted if there are detailed disagreements, but basically we have the same view of where one gets one's moral information from, so to speak, and I think have, roughly speaking, similar moral conclusions.
Yeah, I think that's right. What about strategy? What you would regard as an effective strategy from getting from here to something closer to a libertarian world?
Actually, that's a Substack post that I've started and I've gotten sort of stalled on or have evaded, but in order to do other things. The starting point, I think, is recognizing that the answer is different for different people, that there's a temptation in any movement. I think one of the reasons why you tend to have a lot of internal conflict in ideological movements is the idea that the movement has a certain pool of resources, as it were. And if you have the wrong idea of what we should be doing, you're wasting resources that should be going to my right idea. And that's a mistake that libertarians should be particularly unlikely to make.
Should be.
Because the resources in question are all resources that belong to individual libertarians. And if I am somebody who is not very good at at organizing political campaigns and doesn't enjoy it, and you tell me that's the only way of bringing liberty, then the answer will be that I'm not going to do anything. Whereas if you, I think, correctly recognize that there are a whole bunch of different things, each of which might move the needle a little bit in the right direction, you can then say which of those things is something that I would be good at and that I would enjoy doing. So that one of the approaches, in my view, is the approach that I've been following for a very long time, which is to try to put ideas in circulation and promote them that will result in more people believing what I think are true things in a libertarian direction. So that, to take the simplest example, if most people view a tariff as a costly way in which some Americans benefit at the expense of other Americans, it will be politically more expensive to promote tariffs than if most people view a tariff as a way in which Americans benefit at the expense of foreign countries that want to undercut our prices, so to speak. So by doing things that help people have a correct view of the economics of foreign trade, one shoves a needle a tiny bit in the direction of free trade. And I think that's going to be true pretty broadly. And it is true, in a sense, in the range from my father's arguments to my arguments. That is to say, it's true of spreading ideas about why generally freer markets within our system are good. But it's also true of showing plausible ways that you could have a society entirely consistent with libertarian principles, namely an anarchist one, because if people take ideas seriously, if you say taxation is theft, and somebody says, well, that's interesting. So you're really in favor of having no taxation. How are you planning to play for the police? And you say, I'm a classical liberal and governments are entitled to. Yeah, well, then you don't really believe that taxation is theft, do you? So it seems to me that in that sense, creating even relatively extreme ideas on the libertarian side and spreading them is one way of helping to move the world to more liberty, whether or not we're ever going to get anarchy. So that's one thing. But there are other things that if you're an entrepreneur who can find out a way of making money producing something that the government is currently doing badly, you then reduce the pressure, so that I would say that the idea of abolishing the post office is a whole lot more plausible now that we've got the UPS and FedEx than it would have been 50 years ago.
And email.
Yes. Similarly, if you can do things that make homeschooling much easier and work better, that will reduce the pressure for having public schools and spending money on them. If an entrepreneur could figure out a way of making inexpensive private schools that cost, a fifth what the public schools cost and did a better job, at a fifth what the public schools cost, people might be willing to throw away the free money, as it were, and pay for it, and you would then have less pressure for public schools. So I think there are lots of ways in which a sufficiently clever entrepreneur might change the world in a libertarian direction.
On that note, do you know James Tooley's work at all? The Beautiful Tree?
Oh, yes, sure.
Because he's written a lot about that in the Third World.
Yes. And creating institutions that substitute for government is one thing. Spreading ideas, both moderate and extreme libertarian ideas, is one thing. In terms of politics, I don't think that electing LP candidates in order to pass laws is a very plausible tactic, but trying to elect first running LP candidates, because that's a time when people are talking about political issues. You can therefore use that as a way of spreading your ideas, makes a lot of sense. And if you could occasionally elect one of them, that might be a further way of getting attention to your ideas.
What do you think about the Free State Project?
Oh, that's a neat idea. I think it's a good idea.
Plausible way to do what might normally be quite unlikely, which is actually elect, not
Yes.
large numbers.
But the interesting question is, to what extent is that going to result in making New Hampshire a much more libertarian state? I think it's having at least some effect in that direction already. And if it does that and it's successful, will that then be a way of persuading other people that they should do it? So
that seems like the hope.
Yes. No, I had not actually thought of that, but I should include the Free State Project in my list. I like it. I go to PorcFest every year, more or less, and I occasionally window shop southern New Hampshire on Zillow, although I don't think I'm ever going to leave, because I've got a yard full of fruit trees that I planted, and I'd like to.
It's a great place.
Have you been to PorcFest?
No, I never have. One day.
It's fun. I like it.
I watched your debate with Gene Epstein, though.
Yeah, but I contrast PorcFest to I guess it's Freedom Fest in Vegas.
Yeah.
And I haven't been to Freedom Fest in recent years, so I may be being unfair. But my impression was that although there were some interesting people, interesting things happening, there were too many people there who were trying to sell you a gold mine or the equivalent. And PorcFest, what they're trying to sell you is some Indian food that one of them made. My very favorite thing at PorcFest, I think it was year before last, was an entrepreneur who was making blowguns. They were PVC tubing, but very, very ornamental with, colored tape and such. The darts were made with 3D printing of several different kinds. And the entrepreneur was, I think, 10 years old. And it was reasonably clear that it was, he had support from his parents, but that it was his project, not theirs. He was back last year too, and he still had those things. But he didn't have anything new that struck me as especially interesting. But that kind of feel,
It's quite moving.
yes. Uh, so I no, I like Porkfest.
What about differences in the kinds of social and cultural attitudes? I mean,
Huh. Yeah.
that are consistent with or supportive of liberty. I mean,
Probably a pretty wide range. That is to say, it seems to me that people who like the idea of a sort of a hippie commune, that it's probably an attractive way to live for some people. It is entirely consistent with liberty, as are people who, want a very individualist lifestyle. I guess the most interesting cultural thing that I've observed recently is sort of the rationalist movement, and it tends to be pretty sympathetic libertarian views. I was just commenting recently on Discord correspondence with the author of some rationalist fanfic, a very good one. That's a very good author. That a particular world, basically one of the after life after death worlds in her fictional world, sounded as though I could have written it. Uh, Now that particular culture has features that I don't much agree with. That I think polyamory is probably not a sensible idea for most people, although it may work for a few people. But it's a functional culture. They've got these various group houses and so forth. So I guess I don't really feel as though there is one true libertarian lifestyle, as it were.
I think that's fair to say. I mean, my impression, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but is that culturally there are left and right libertarians, and you've never struck me as especially right wing or left wing on those senses. Do you think there are any particularly interesting or insightful or both libertarians who are clearly more on the left or on the right culturally, and not just personally, but advocating it and speaking on behalf of it?
I don't know if you would count Scott Alexander as a libertarian. I'm not sure he would.
I mean, I take him at his word when he describes himself as kind of a moderate left-ish libertarian.
Yeah. But I certainly think highly of him, and I think his cultural sympathies are left wing. Some of mine are, some of mine aren't. Uh, I'm just thinking of who would be a clear example on the other side, and the answer is no one's coming to mind at the moment. Data Secrets Locks has a bunch of people who pretty clearly are right wingers, some of whom are libertarian, some of whom aren't. I don't know if Peter Thiel counts as a libertarian. Maybe.
All I know is roughly what he said about himself, but I don't
Yes.
know in any detail what his views are. It seems to me like a right-leaning libertarian from what he says about himself, but that's all I know.
Yeah. But I guess I don't really think very much in terms of looking for people who are
Sure.
symbols.
What do you think is the most common misconception people have about anarcho-capitalism?
Well, one sort of misleading thing is people say, well, the law will be up to the highest bidder. And they're not thinking about the fact that in exactly the same sense, what cars are produced is up to the highest bidder. But that does not mean that the car companies spend all of their resources making luxury cars for billionaires, because there aren't very many billionaires. And similarly, I would expect that in an anarcho-capitalist society, if you are rich, you probably get a better quality of rights enforcement than if you're poor, because they're willing to spend more money making sure that if anybody steals from you, they catch him. But I don't think it makes much sense to imagine that means that rich people can kill anybody they like to, because the cost, even in dollars, of being killed is greater than the benefit of killing somebody in almost all cases. Anyway, so beyond that, I guess it's not really a misconception, but many people presumably imagine a single law code that's written by libertarians over all of it, and that certainly is the view of some anarcho-capitalists, just not mine. Some people seem to think it means no law at all, that it sort of is relying on people being moral, which I'm certainly not willing to do. And I don't think most anarcho-capitalists assume that.
Yeah, I don't think that's a weakness of libertarians, especially. I mean, if anything, the opposite. The idea is to assume crooked timber. Are you following Prospera at all?
A little.
Because your son Patri is somewhat involved in that project?
I'm not sure if he's actually involved in Prosper. He was certainly involved early on, and then at one point gave up on it, and then it turned out it was working. And he's involved in an investment fund for people investing in projects in new cities. But he certainly is in contact with the Prosper people, but I'm not sure he has any official involvement. But it's a neat idea. It might even work. I was actually thinking of possibly visiting there next month. There's I'm told they're having a couple of day event on life extension, and I'm very much in favor of extending my life. And my son Patri's thinks that one of their people actually has a somewhat experimental medical process that may significantly slow aging, which is a subject of interest to me.
Sure.
So I may end up going there. I've never been there, but I'm thinking about that.
I almost went myself, and I still am planning at some point.
The other place, of course, that I may want to visit, depending on what happens in the next week or two, is Argentina.
I haven't followed. What's the background there?
They have a 2-round presidential election system, and the candidate who got the largest number of votes in the first round described himself as an anarcho-capitalist.
Really?
Libertarian by the name of Millet. He got like 35 or 40% of basically, well, more than three-person thing, and he's currently favored to win the election, which is happening shortly. And
you can claim some amount of credit for that. I mean, the
that I don't know.
Not directly, but indirectly, the ideas of anarcho-capitalism has been popularized.
As it happened, probably less than a year ago, some point in the last year, I think, I was at a conference organized by, I think, Liberty Fund, where one of the other participants was an Argentinian economist who thought I should visit Argentina. And at this point, if Millet wins, I would be delighted to visit Argentina and see what it's like. It might be a little risky because South American countries' politics sometimes gets violent, but it would certainly be interesting. But I don't know the candidate at all. That is, I only know secondhand stuff about him.
I'll have to look into that a little bit. I wouldn't normally care about following even American politics. That's really interesting. What do you regard if you were to look forward in the next, several decades as the most promising prospect for some level of relatively radical experimentation with anarcho-capitalism?
But I think you've touched on two of the answers, namely the New City movement on the one hand and the Free State Project. Now, I don't think either of them is going to give you a radical experimentation with anarcho-capitalism, but they're both going to give you substantial steps in the right direction if we're lucky. And the third, which has been happening quietly, is online, where to a considerable extent you already have anarcho-capitalism in the sense that, for example, what's enforcing contracts on eBay is almost entirely reputational, not legal enforcement. So I think a lot of the online infrastructure, as it were, is becoming a world where states don't have very much effect on how people interact with each other, and there are other mechanisms for doing what we think of as the work of states.
Are you worried at all about the kinds of things that were revealed in the Twitter files? Do those make you more or less pessimistic about the prospect of the online world being somewhat free from state influence?
Well, of course, the state will influence just like everybody will influence it. The question is, does the state have the power to stop people from doing things? And mostly, I think it doesn't. It certainly will make attempts to, and it will sometimes succeed. But it seems to me that that's a world where the logic of the technology is on our side.
Sure.
That, as I put it a long time ago, you can't get a bullet through a T1 line.
So I mentioned earlier, yourself, Murray Rothbard, Morris and Linda Tannehill were maybe some of the first prominent people to articulate this modern vision of anarcho-capitalism. What younger current scholars working on this do you think are doing especially interesting work right now?
Well, I like Humor, who you've mentioned already. Other than that, I'm sure there are some good people who I don't know, but I can't think of anybody else who I've interacted with who struck me as, having interesting new ideas.
Well, Michael Humer is a great recommendation. Any particular, whether new or not, any particular books you would recommend as a good supplement or complement to Machinery?
Sure. The other Scott, Seeing Like a State.
Oh, yes. Oh, now I'm blanking on his name, but Seeing Like a State, Against the Grain. I know who you're talking about. He's an anthropologist.
Yeah, I haven't
more
read,
on the left.
I haven't read Against the Grain, but Seeing Like a State, and there's another book. They're both good. He doesn't think himself as a libertarian. In fact, I would say he goes to some effort in one of the books to make it clear he's not one of those icky libertarians. There's a footnote where he is in fact agreeing with
James Scott.
A footnote where he is agreeing with, I think, Hayek on something, and then makes a point of the fact that that doesn't mean that he approves of all of these silly people. And I've met him. I like him. We had a more or less debate a few years ago. He might be the best example of somebody who I actually learned things from that are relevant to the anarchist position. And part of it is that in one of his books, I think it's not Seeing Like a State, but I read them long enough ago, so I'm not clearly distinguishing what's in which. But one of the books he's discussing in Asia, the situation where you had states and stateless areas adjacent, and at various points the states expanded, at various points they contracted for different reasons, and so forth. And one of the interesting points he makes is that it is easier for a state to conquer you if your food is rice or wheat than if your food is root vegetables. Because rice and wheat, you harvest it and you've got storage facilities full of the stuff, and an enemy army can come in and grab it. Root vegetables are in the ground until you eat them. So if a invader wants to seize your food supply, he's got to actually go, dig up all of whatever you have.
I wonder if that has any relevance for Irish English colonial history.
Well, I don't know about that, but it struck me not that particular example is useful, but that the idea of saying under what circumstance, what are the things that make it more expensive to rule people or less expensive to rule people, or to conquer people, or to get rid of conquests and such, was a very interesting and perceptive way of thinking about it. He also gives, I think, some good arguments about the ways in which attempts to push people into doing things the way that other people had decided were the scientific way of doing it tended to be mistakes. And, some of that I knew and some of that I didn't.
Yeah, actually, I'm aware of his work, but I haven't read any of his books, and it's a blank spot that I'm meaning to remedy.
Seeing Like a State, and there's one other, the Against the Grain, and he's got one on which is something like 2 Cheers for Anarchy that I didn't think was very good, and I'm not sure if I've read all of it. But Seeing Like a State is one of the 2 books that I liked, and I'm just not blocking at the moment on the name of the other one. But he's neat, and I liked him. Other than that, well, actually, there's an interesting book, which I've actually got a draft chapter on my website, and I'm not sure if I did a Substack post on it or not, called The Organizational Revolution, which it's relevant. It's not really about libertarianism at all, but it's about the ways in which societies changed as a result of technological changes, where the central problem is really the principal agent problem, the problem which we typically, our standard solution to this problem in our society is you hire people, that you hire somebody, you watch what he's doing, and you fire him if he doesn't do what you've hired him to do. And the argument this person is making is that was not the standard way of organizing things 400 years ago or 500 years ago. And the reason it was not was that doing it requires a world both where you can monitor people fairly easily and where it's fairly easy to see whose fault results are. And that in a world where transportation is much more irregular. So if it might be that the reason the person didn't show up at his job was that the road was out. Uh, a world where you don't have very readily available time information, and so it's hard to coordinate, and so forth and so on. A bunch of things that you end up with two other mechanisms becoming more important. One of them being patronage, one of them being that you give the job to somebody you have other reasons to trust, maybe because he's a relative or the family of somebody else who you gave jobs to 20 years ago, and so forth. And you can monitor in the sense that if after 10 years it's clear he's not doing a good job, you can not only get rid of him, but stop doing nice things for him and tell other people not to do nice things for him. But you don't. So that's one approach to is patronage. And the other approach is making the job a property right and setting it up in such a way that the income from doing the job is to a significantly degree dependent on how well you do it. So that, for example, the British Navy with a system where if you sunk an enemy warship or captured an enemy merchant ship, the captain gets a third of the value of it, and the officers get a third, and the crew get a third, if I remember correctly. It was some division like that, but it was basically and not actually in the Navy, but in the Army, position as an officer was a property right that you could sell. And if its system is set up well, the value of that will be higher because it's a officer's position in a particular regiment. So if you make the regiment do very well, so it's likely to get loot and get rewards and things of that sort. Your position as an officer is worth more, and you can sell it for more. And on the other hand, if you are really good at what you're doing, you correctly believe that being a higher officer will make you money, and therefore you're willing to buy one. So he's basically describing a system in which you're using property rights instead of employment. So it's a very interesting book. And
the organizational revolution.
Yeah. But anyway, that would be an example of something I learned some interesting ideas from. But I don't really think of it as a matter of what libertarians do you learn things from. It's of what people do you learn things relevant to libertarianism.
Sure. Yeah.
From.
No, I think that's very reasonable. In fact, it's probably more trustworthy.
And it's also true that in the course of doing the work that led me to my most recent book, The Legal System's Very Different book, I was encountering work by people like the British anthropologist who was basically the expert on the Somali system, which I learned interesting things from.
And that was the first episode that David was on, by the way. If anyone wants to check out that episode, we talked about legal systems very different from our own. One of the earlier episodes, I forget the number.
Yes. So I learned useful stuff from that. And, I learned useful stuff in lots of weird ways.
You mentioned your collection that you might be putting together. Are there any other projects you're working on right now?
Not really. Not in you. There's projects that have nothing to do with libertarianism or writing, of course.
But you've been more active on your Substack and blogging, so that's
well, I'm not blogging anymore. I'm only doing the Substack, and to some extent, my interaction on Data Secret Locks, or maybe even on Astro Codex 10, sometimes produces things that I then turn into other writing. Mostly not, but I concluded a long time ago that arguments are a good way of getting educated, because when you're having an argument with somebody and you want to find the evidence that supports your position, and you want to check whether the evidence he offers, that makes it fun. And so you end up doing what's essentially research. So to take a very simple example, the stuff I was doing on the question of whether national self-determination has good consequences ended up my looking up lots of interesting things. It ended up with it occurring to me that the US and Canada were an obvious case. That was not originally, I was thinking, well, I know about these African cases where lots of violence happened, but then let me keep going. And well, it occurs to me that Indonesia was a big country which used to be a colony and stopped being a colony. Did they kill anybody? Well, yes, it turns out they killed about 500,000 to 1,000,000 people at one point after independence. So in that sense, I just find that being involved in what's essentially an argument is a good incentive for learning stuff.
Especially if you enjoy arguments.
And especially if you have the access to the internet.
Yes.
It was much harder in the old days.
And quality interlocutors. Not all of them are, but that's one of the benefits always has been of Scott Alexander's blog, and the various commenters are bright, engaging, yes, high quality people to talk to.
Yes. I was thinking of having some reference on my Substack post to Slate Star Codex of Blessed Memory.
Your Substack, is there any other places that people can find you if they want to keep up with your work?
As I mentioned, my webpage has links to most of what I do. It has links to the full text of multiple books. It has a link to the Substack and a link to the blog. And that's probably where you can, it's not organized very well. I have, when I do an interview online, I generally add it to the page of links, which is my talks and interviews or some category like that.
Well, that reminds me, I wanted to ask what do you think has been your favorite or most interesting debate you've done that is available online in the last 5 or 10 years?
Well, it's a much, much older one, but the debate with George Smith on...
That's a great one.
Oh, no, I thought it was really neat. In fact, I was just yesterday, I came across a YouTube of a panel I was on in 1983. And that was fun just to listen to see what I was saying there, and mostly the same views I have now. I haven't changed very much over time. I looked an awful lot younger. But no, I think the George Smith debate was very good. George unfortunately died recently.
He did.
I was trying to get in touch with him so that I could get his cooperation in webbing the text of the debate. And I eventually got somebody else who agreed with him, with his position more or less, to go over, because turning speech into text is not always trivial, but I think I did a fair job.
Sure.
So I now have...
You want to make sure that you're not altering things in your favor.
Yes, correct. So that's one of my chapter drafts is that text.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Yeah, again, there's a link on the web page on the top level of my website, which is not particularly prominent, to the project for creating book chapters. And there's also a link to a different project, which I haven't worked on for the last year or two, but it might go back to, which is a project for a collection of works of literature which teach interesting economic lessons. So my probably favorite example for that would be a short story by Poul Anderson called Margin of Profit. And the point of the story is that in order to stop somebody from doing something, you don't have to make it impossible, just unprofitable. And it's quite explicit that that's what's going on. And in fact, the title is Margin of Profit. And it's a very good story, as Poul Anderson's things usually are. Basically, it is science fiction context where there is a unpleasant empire that is seizing trading ships, spaceships, and brainwashing their crew in order to increase its navy, in effect. And stopping it costs more than it's worth, that the trading companies could have a war with it, and the trading companies are pretty wealthy and powerful, and they could probably win a war with this little empire, but the cost of doing that is higher than the profits to be made on the trade routes, so they're not going to do it. And they could arm their ships, but armed ships don't carry enough goods to pay for themselves, so they won't do that. And it turns out that the solution is to arm one ship in 4. The enemy warships have much larger crews than the trading ships. So 3 times out of 4, the bad guys win. 1 time out of 4, the good guys win. And the bad guys are on net losing people, not gaining people, because the crews are more than 4 times as large. and therefore not being stupid, they'll eventually stop. And after that, maybe we can do business. It's really it's a very good story, which makes that point. And there are other ones of which that's also true. Quite a lot, in fact. I've got, probably 20 or 30 or 40 stories, poems, and so forth. There's Kipling's Arithmetic on the Frontier, which is basically about the U.S.-Afghan war, except that it was written a century or so earlier. One sword not stolen from the camp will pay for all the school expenses of any Huron Valley scamp who knows no word of modes or tenses, but being blessed with perfect sight, picks off our messmates left and right. The captives of our bow and spear are cheap, alas, as we are dear. So it's a very neat point about the advantage that that the undeveloped society has over the developed society, namely that it's got labor which has got the relevant skills, namely fighting people, and is cheap.
Did you ever assign these stories when you were teaching?
Good question. I don't remember. I might have. I think I very occasionally referred to them in fact, I know I refer.
You definitely referred to some of these stories in hidden order.
I refer to Niven's stuff on the downside of organ markets. Well, not of organ markets, the downside of the idea that if somebody is executed for a capital crime, his organs forfeit. And that I have a published journal article on the inefficiency of efficient punishment, where the point is that on the one hand, you would like to have criminal punishments where the loss to the criminal is a gain to somebody else, such as a fine, as opposed to imprisonment where the loss to the criminal is also a cost to the enforcers who've got to pay for the prison. But the downside of an efficient punishment is that it's then in somebody's interest to give it to you, whether or not
you deserve it. Yeah, incentivizes maybe unjust punishments,
or even if not literally unjust, making punishments more and more severe.
Sure.
And in fact, that occurred to me, and then I came across Larry Niven stories, which are precisely on that point, because they're in the context of the realization by people in a hypothetical future that if you're going to execute somebody anyway, there's no reason to throw away his organs. It's the perfect opportunity to transplant them. And that seems like a fine idea. And so more and more countries make it. And then, of course, the number of capital crimes goes up because there's a shortage of organs. So it's the story. I think the first story in that series is one where at the end you realize that the person who's awaiting execution his crime is having for 3 times driven in such a way as to endanger human life. So 3 dangerous driving convictions and you're out. So that would be an example. And that one I do cite in my published work.
No particular social media presence you want me to include?
No, only the fact that my web page has a page of my talks and interviews, and it isn't organized by date, so it's not obvious which are the new ones. But if you look down it, and it also has the links to the very old ones that are now webbed, such as the one I was just listening to yesterday, which I just put up yesterday as a link after discovering it.
My guest today has been David Friedman. We've been talking about anarcho-capitalism and a wide range of topics, but his book that we initially started with is The Machinery of Freedom, Guide to a Radical Capitalism, which is currently in its 3rd edition. David, thank you for joining me on Ideas Having Sex.
And a PDF of which can be downloaded for free from my webpage.
Thank you for listening to Ideas Having Sex, where we have stimulating conversations on social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you're a fan of what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. I'm Chris Kaufman. Thanks for listening.